So I'm still Guillaume Vadot, still working my PhD in Paris One University, and an activist concerned by police violence.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Tessa Diphoorn. I'm an anthropologist from Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and I've done a lot of research about private security and police reform, particularly in South Africa, also in Kenya, but today I'll be talking more about South Africa. So.
Good morning, everyone. Again, Mutuma Ruteere from the Center for Human Rights and Policy Studies.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Husain Hadid, and I work with Haki Africa in Mombasa.
Fantastic. So that's everyone. I will move on to the next session. We'll basically be continuing from the discussions that we had earlier in the day on basically providing an understanding of policing basically in the country. And here we're trying to look at, there's a lot of historical perspectives that we'll have in this session, where we're trying to look at the developments of a time of police reform. We have people in this room who I think have worked on police reform for the better part of their lives since the 90s. So we're trying to see the progress of this. What have we managed to develop? What have been the changes? Where we're looking at reforms not only in the sense of providing accountability mechanisms, but also on transforming police-civilian relations. We are trying to see what progress we've made in this field. So I'll begin by introducing the first speaker, Dr. Ruteere.
Thank you very much, Brian. So I'll very quickly shift gears from what I was talking about in the morning and center my conversation in this session with regard to the Kenya Police and the Kenya Police Service rather. And I've been asked basically to talk about the historical developments as well as how they are linked to the current context of policing as well as the whole question of police violence. So I'll very briefly talk about mention a few things about the evolution of the Kenya Police Service, or the National Police Service as we call it now, and then mention a few things about the post-2010 Constitution, policing and that context, and conclude by raising a few questions with regard to where we go next with regard to the challenge of addressing police violence. So historically, when you look at the colonial or the formation of the Kenyan state, probably no other institution other than the institution of the chief is so interlinked to the state formation as the institution of the police. Reason being that when the police service was founded in the 1890s in Mombasa, the objective of that service, of that force, as it was known, was not to provide law and order as we expect in the contemporary nation state, but it was basically to pacify the natives and to pacify that protectorate then basically for the settlers, but also for economic exploitation by the company that was setting up. We should not forget that initially it was actually set up basically as a company that basically first of all had control of the region. So when we are thinking about the origins of this service, it doesn't have the origins of the police service as it was set up in the UK or in England for that matter, which was to basically provide law and order for the services. And the other characteristic and feature of that beginning of that service that was militarized in nature. Because of the nature of the threat that was facing the colonization of this place, of necessity they had to be militarized because the colonial authorities had to send pacification expeditions. And if you go to the Kenyan history, you read about the pacification missions that were sent to all these various communities so as to make the building of the railway, but also to law and order and safety for the settlers possible. No surprise then, the name Askari, if you think about Askari in Kenya, which basically means a military officer, is also the ones that we used for police officers. All of them were Askari, and the distinction between the military officer and the police officer was quite tenuous in that sense. The other characteristic also is that this service was ethnicized in nature. The thinking was, in terms of the mind of the colonizer, was first, this is an expanse that is inhabited by the various ethnic groups. You have to profile them, who is loyal, who can do police service. So you find that the recruitment followed ethnic lines. And there are some ethnic groups that were considered not fit for policing service. And there are some ethnic groups that were thought these are the ideal types basically for recruitment in the police services, and that's what happened. Let's also not forget that in the colonial law and security imagination, the African was a threat to physical rights and physical security of whites, and therefore law enforcement was basically designed to contain the natives in the rural reserves, largely away from the white settlers and from the urban areas, which is where the police largely operated. We'll again find in the post-colonial patterns, even where police stations are located in a city like Nairobi, when you ask yourself where they are sited and where they are, it's because of that colonial imagination. They followed certain patterns. They were situated where they would provide services to the white inhabitants, but not to the African natives who are confined to certain places only. So the primary approach was the of pacification of communities, deployment of punitive and imaginations, because the prestige of the colonial state had to be imposed by these police services. Independence provided the opportunity to dismantle and transform these services into services that would actually be serving the rights of all citizens. Unfortunately, colonialism did not do that, and I think Mahmoud Mamdani does an excellent job of speaking about policing and other law and order institutions, particularly in those post-colonial states that did not undergo transformation, such as Kenya. So what happens in those states? What happens in those states is that the institutions of the police and questions of law and order are not racialized, but they are passed on now to provide security and service to the elite that got into power. So it moves from being a service or a force that is in the service of a racial elite to a service and a force that is basically in existence to serve the political elite that got into power. They also inherited the repressive powers of that police services. Remember, there was no culture, there was no tradition of accountability in the colonial police service. Building a new culture was something that would have required very deliberate dismantling of practices, thinking, training, and everything within the police service to make it a service that would actually serve the public. That was not done at independence. In fact, any attempt to create a kind of independence police services was very quickly scattered in 1964 with some constitutional amendments. And subsequent to that, we saw the police services becoming the repressive tool of the repressive governments that we had. So you remember the political misuses of the police in the 1970s, in the 1980s, that culminated with more Kenya detentions as well as arrests. And going on after that to the 90s and even to the present, where you see the police approach to most of political action as instinctively repressive. So there's a history that explains why the police services are not there. But that history is not sufficient to explain why we've not taken advantage or to dismantle that. Nor does it end there, because there's very interesting efforts from the 1990s, peaking in the 1990s and later in the 2000s, to transform the institutions of the police. Remember the struggle for democratization in the 90s, that peaked in the 90s. Transformation of the police services was always at the center stage of discussions because of the experiences the public had with the police service. We reach a watershed moment and an interesting turning point, would say, in 2007, when the post-election violence happened, and one of the part of the settlements for that was that we needed to actually transform these police institutions. That's how we ended up with the very first national task force on police reforms that made comprehensive recommendations on what needed to be reformed so as to transform the police service. Again, the new constitution of 2010 provides the other turning point, and I want to say a few things now with regard to the post-2010 constitution and policing. What the 2010 constitution does is that it doesn't just create new institutions such as National Police Service Commission and National Police Service, but it also brings new values, new principles in how security is supposed to be governed. So when you look at not just Chapter 14 that deals with security, but every other part of the Constitution, there is a reference to human rights values, democratic principles. The security, the purpose of security is actually to enhance democracy, that security should always, operations and the other practices should be governed by the principles of human rights. So you can say this is one of the best constitutions in terms of providing the kind of guiding principles on how police services ought to operate. It also creates new institutions, as I've mentioned. Accountability is very key, as well as civilian oversight and democratic accountability of security services. And the Constitution also provides for operational autonomy of the police service and the operational independence of the police service and the Inspector General. However, not policy independence. And sometimes there is, in the public discussions, a confusion of that. The police don't have policy independence. They have operational independence in making the decisions, but the policy is set by the executive. So we have the laws, we have the institutions. So where are we in 2018 January? What has changed? And I was just reminding this morning, reading the news from the meeting that the LSK had organized on elections, and Justice Kriegler, who was part of the forensic analysis of our botched election in 2007, warning that we have put too much trust in the laws and believing that we're fixing our political problems through laws, and warning us that laws mean nothing if you don't fix our politics. And I'm struck by how that is also applicable with regard to how the police have turned out. We have very good laws, we have good, fairly good institutional architecture, but they have not yet worked. And it's, when you look at it, it's very tempting to despair and say nothing is going to work. But I think we need to go further, as Justice Kriegler is challenging us, to ask ourselves what has worked well, why has it worked, and what is not working. So what has worked well? What would we say? The fact that we have an independent policing oversight authority, and unfortunately they were supposed to be here, but I've just gotten a message from them that things fell in between the cracks, and they apologize. But nevertheless, I can authoritatively say that we have a fairly good independent policing oversight authority. I know sometimes that's, most people very skeptical of that. It is understandable. But when you do a comparative analysis of independent policing oversights globally, I can confidently tell you that we are one of the best. Independent oversight of policing is very, very difficult everywhere in the world. And one of the challenges is that in a context like Kenya, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority is supposed to complement an internal oversight authority. Now, Internal Affairs Unit in Kenya, which was set up as part of the post-2010 constitution, doesn't work. It doesn't exist. It doesn't have the personnel. It doesn't have the political support. So all the problems within the police service are shoved to the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, which makes it inefficient, which makes it very difficult for them to deliver. And I actually sympathize with them because it's an impossible job. They've been set up to fail. Nevertheless, it's there. It is striking that the IFRA is not in the Constitution. And yet, when you compare it with the National Police Service Commission, it seems to have more operational independence. It seems to have more respect, and it's not in the Constitution, which tells us that you don't even need to be the Constitution to actually be effective, that the leadership is actually as important of these institutions to breathe life into them. So internal affairs has not worked. The culture of policing has not worked. And one of the major challenges that we've seen is that we have the laws, we have even set up out the new trainings of police services, but the police haven't changed. Why haven't the police changed? Because we haven't yet tackled the culture. Police don't govern by the laws. Police don't, when they're meeting on the streets, don't ask what does the law tell us. In fact, the police on the beat will tell you that what they operate on every day is the stories they have been told by veterans. When you go out there, it is you and your God. You shoot before they kill, you get them before they kill you. When a police officer is leaving their house, they are using the stories they have been told by the veterans who have been there beforehand, have survived. So long as the stories that the veterans are giving the younger recruits are the stories that get them before they get you, we are yet to change the culture, and that's part of the problem. We are yet to change the culture also because in the thinking of how police is organized, we're still barracking them. We're still putting them in barracks. They are still living in those barracks. They don't still live with ordinary individuals. We still haven't cracked the culture because the Police Service Commission, in their wisdom, decided that we even need to lower the qualifications. And I'm not saying the best educated people make the best police officers. But the message that is sent to police officers when you say we need to lower the qualification is that we don't think this is very important. We don't think that it's a very demanding task to police people. So get the people who believe that I failed, the system failed me, or I failed in the education system. And you know, in this country, we are obsessed with the exam results. If you did not meet a certain level, everyone says you failed. So you failed, we make you a police officer. So you go there, I failed, I'm only a police officer, all these people look down upon me, so I'm going to show them who has power. This is part of the culture. It's inverted in places like the UK. The police have a problem with people of lower class, isn't it? The migrants and the rest. In this country, the police, on the other hand, begin from the point, I'm lower class, so I'm going to show these people who believe that they are rich, they live in these places, that I have the power, and I have the power of the gun. So we need to start changing that culture, and that's what we are not yet cracking because it's not easy. And it's very easy for me to criticize from the vantage point of being an academic. But changing culture, we know it's not easy. We need to give them, even the policymakers, tangible recommendations on how do they change culture. Because that's part of where the challenge is. Brian, tell me when I run out of time. I'm about to. Okay, I'm about to finish. So that's, in my view, the greatest challenge is that. The greatest challenge that I also see is that we have not yet, as part of that culture, changed how police respond to gatherings, and public gatherings and protests. The culture is still that you people who are protesting, you are undermining law and order. The police still don't see themselves as facilitating the constitutional right to protest. They see themselves as coming to save the country or the administration of the day from the disorder that the protesters are bringing. So we need to creatively engineer how police respond to public conduct protests because we don't give them the right tools, that's part of it. They are not given good training, but also the mentality within the police service itself, it's yet to come around to the fact that when people call for a protest, our job is to facilitate them to protest, not to go and stop them. Right? So that's I would say those going forward. These are some of the major areas I think we need to focus on. We need to look for allies, and I think Irungu in the morning asked, well, how can we enlist the public? How can we take advantage, for instance, when people who are prominent become victims? And I think that those are the kind of opportunities and options we need to look at to mobilize a critical mass that starts demanding a better police service. That actually, they are not just after criminals, because the Kenyan public believes that so long as you kill the right people, there is no problem. So we need to change the narratives that they actually, the risk is that you could also be killed. They are not just killing criminals. And we need to find allies in the media, we need to find allies in the legislature, as well as within the executive and police service itself. So largely, I would say that the police still, in spite of the laws, in spite of the good constitution, have a serious problem in how they police the poor, in how they police those who have been labeled enemies of the state, for instance, if you are seen as a terrorist, and in how they manage public gatherings and protests. I would say those are the three big areas. And finally, part of that also is the fact that we back to where we began, that the police were created to serve historically a small elite. And they are yet to change from that mentality, nor have the elites themselves done much to change that, because when you look at anyone appointed in any senior position, the first thing they do as a mark to convince them they now have the power is to get a police bodyguard. If you don't have a police guard, it means you have fallen out of favor. Even the progressive politicians, all of them cling to a police bodyguard. What does that tell you? That they don't worry about the space that there is unprotected so long as my private security is protected. So the elite that should be championing police reforms is yet to get from this mentality that I need police reforms. I don't know whether you know how many police bodyguards the chair of the National Police Service Commissioner has. Just watch when he's in those public places. You'll be astounded. And yet he's the one supposed to be providing guidance on how to equitably deploy police resources. So finally, let me end by this quote from this former police officer but also became a scholar, J.C. Anderson on police. And he says, the police, like laws, reflect the nature of the society which they serve. Corrupt societies deserve and get corrupt police. Totalitarian societies acquire omnipotent police. Violent societies get violent police, such as ours. Tolerant societies get tolerant police. Wise societies bridle or control or restrain police powers. Police are not manufactured in any factory. They are your brothers and your sisters. So if there are crooked police out there, they are your siblings. So why do they become crooked? That's the question we have not asked ourselves. They are not from Mars, they are from us. They are reflection to a very considerable extent of how we think power should be organized and distributed in the society. It's power to serve the elite and power to control those we think are threat to our wealth and privilege. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Once again, my name is Tessa. I would like to apologize in advance. I've been struck by a big cold, so there might be a sneeze coming up here somewhere, so please bear with me. So I guess I'm a little bit of the odd one out today and tomorrow because I'll be the only one talking about South Africa. And what I want to do is kind of share some of my experiences about police reform in South Africa. And the idea is not to evaluate whether police reform has been successful or not, or whether we can speak of a reformed police force, but just to kind of discuss some of the key issues that have been identified over the years, and to see how we can kind of draw from that to outline comparative perspectives, which is kind of the theme of this workshop. A lot of what I'll be saying today, I realize now, is a bit of a repetition of what Mutuma just said, but I'm sure we can all manage that very well. So in order to, oh yeah, is the PowerPoint up? Yes. Yeah? It's okay. So in order for us to kind of look at, so police reform implies change. It implies some type of improvement, transformation. So without going into kind of the history books of South Africa, we do need to look at where we started with, which was, in the case of South Africa, refers to the apartheid regime, of course. Now, a lot can be said about apartheid. Many books have been written about it, so let me try and summarize it very briefly. Was that apartheid, as the word suggests, refers to separateness, and it's about segregating society based on their, in the South African context, racial identity. And so the entire life was divided into four main racial groups: the whites, also known as Europeans, the coloreds, the Asians, and the Africans, who are also referred to as natives. So the whole society was structured accordingly in order to segregate these four different racial groups, politically, economically, socially, etc. And there were many state bodies that played a fundamental role in enforcing this ideology, yet it was primarily the state police that was primarily responsible for enforcing the segregation. Ms. Gordon says the state police was the, oh, sorry, next slide, sorry, I have to adjust to telling somebody to flip for me. So the state police force was the frontline enforcers of the apartheid system as a whole. And this entailed several things. The first was that it was about maintaining white privilege. So we can see that 75% of the country's police stations were concentrated in the white areas, and those that did actually exist in the non-white areas, also known as townships, were vastly under-resourced. And so non-white areas were policed in order to control their movement from entering other areas. And so the focus was also not on crime. So policing during apartheid was about maintaining this racist segregation, and it wasn't about crime prevention or crime investigation, etc. And it's estimated that only about 10% of the actual police force was involved in crime detection and investigation. So as a result, we see kind of policing style that is highly racist, politicized, and highly militarized, with extreme use of brutalized methods, confessions under torture, and it's often used as this mentality was called the skop, skiet, and donder, which is translated as this kick, shoot, and thunder mentality, that this was kind of the modus of the apartheid state police. Now, during apartheid as well, the structure of the police is quite complicated because there were in total 11 different police forces. So we have the South African police, which was established in 1913 and very much based on a colonial model that was similar to what we see in Kenya, highly militarized from its inception. But we also had the homeland police. So throughout South Africa, you had what they sometimes call tribal reserves, homelands, Bantustans, which also had their own police forces as well. So we have kind of very different pockets of forces, and combined this was about 140,000 police personnel. In addition to that, we have this wide range of non-state policing. So policing agents operating outside or as state proxies. And in the non-white areas, this ranged from vigilante groups, gangs, self-defense forces, very often highly politicized with the resistance movement. And in the white areas, we had a very strong and booming private security industry that kind of acted as a private supplement to the state and very much worked together with the apartheid regime. So to summarize, what we see is in white areas, we see very kind of imbalanced and an unequal way in which policing was provided. So in white areas, we find a very strong presence of a state police supported by a private security industry, and in non-white areas, we find a very absent and brutal state police, etc. So moving forward to the early 90s, the release of Nelson Mandela, the unbanning of the ANC. I won't get into all of these details because let's just all assume that we know this, or if you don't, please feel free to ask me a question afterwards. And this kind of started the way for peace negotiations. And from the start of the negotiations in the early 1990s, policing and security were highly prioritized as this is the key issue that needs to be addressed first. And kind of similar to other parts of the world, the overall aim was to eradicate the apartheid legacies, to create an accountable police force, create a legitimate police force, and to create one that serves all South Africans in an equal manner. And there were three main documents that kind of, within the constitution elsewhere, that kind of prompted this kind of change. It was the South African Police Service Act in '95, the National Crime Prevention Strategy, and the White Paper on Safety and Security, which are continuously referenced to because these have been three kind of key acts and documents that have kind of propelled the change. And there's kind of this emic term, something that I heard throughout my research in my fieldwork in South Africa continuously, is that this whole process was referred to as from the old school to the new. So, and I'll get back to this later, that this is presented as a very linear process. So it's about, we have something and we're going to change it to something completely different. And again, although much can be said about police reform, let me just discuss four key pillars that were the most predominant ways in kind of moving forward, and which again, I think we can see a lot of similarities with the Kenyan case. So the first was, again, creating a new police force, which was the amalgamation of these 11 different police forces. So we have to think about this, that these people all had different training backgrounds, different experiences, different etc. So you're basically lumping people together in a force that come from very divergent backgrounds with different ideas of what policing is and what it means to be a police officer. A big thing which we also see here is this change from a force to a service. And now, without getting into this kind of analysis of this neoliberal idea of privatizing state services, the name of the police force changed. So it went from the South African Police to the South African Police Services, and kind of the whole mantra of becoming a service, providing a service to the people. We also see a change of rank structure. So military ranks were changed to British policing rank systems. So a general became a commissioner, a brigadier became a director. And a kind of a general revamping of the image of the police. So new uniforms, new badges, new police stations, and all this done to kind of enhance the public perception of the police service. A second major issue was a focus on community policing. And again, a lot has been written about the successes, but predominantly about the failures of kind of implementing community policing forms, particularly from above. But the main aim was to have police stations throughout the country set up for us that would act as a platform to engage with citizens and to kind of restore confidence with communities. Again, we see a lot of the similar things going on here in Kenya. A third issue is what is called the multi-agency approach. So one of the key things of police reform was about we need to work together with other agents, particularly within the private sector. So we see a lot of public-private policing partnerships with the private security industry, but also with businesses. There's a big organization in South Africa called Business Against Crime, which has donated a lot of money to the police and has set up all these kind of local initiatives within various police stations. So it was very much about, we cannot do this alone. We need to work together with the partners that are out there. And the fourth dimension was the establishment of a police oversight mechanism, which I'll get into that later, but which was called the Independent Complaints Directorate and was set up in 1997, which was supposed to act as this independent, act as an independent external mechanism to deal with complaints against the police. Very similar to what we see here with IPOA. And the idea was that it would be independent of the police and etc. So if we go back now, as kind of what Mutuma did, can we speak of reform? Now, the opinions on this are very varied. So on the one hand, these are some of the main issues that are used in kind of discussing the kind of general idea of police reform in South Africa. So the first, undeniably, is the issue of crime. And so if you ask South African citizens, well, has the police reformed, or what do you think police? Their initial answer is always, well, crime is extremely high, so how can we talk about a better police force? And one of the particular things, what is interesting about this is that actually, if you look at the South African crime statistics, crime has actually decreased substantially since the early 1990s, particularly homicide rates. Yet there's a continuing perception that that crime is always increasing. And one of the reasons for this is there's a slight rise in the trio crimes. So this refers to the business robberies, carjackings, and house robberies, which are the most personal forms of crime in a way that affects your sense of personal safety and play a fundamental role in your perception of fear. So without getting again into this discussion of crime, there's this idea that crime is continuously rising and the police is incapable of dealing with the situation. And what we've also seen is kind of this remilitarization of the South African police. So in April 2010, the South African Police Service reinstated the old ranking system that they had tried to get rid of. So we went back into which directors became brigadiers, and the Ministry of Safety and Security became the Ministry of Police. So we see this kind of going back to a militarized system. And throughout 2010 and 2011, there was a lot of discussion about what they called the shoot to kill policy, which referred to an amendment of the Section 49 of the Criminal Procedure Act, which was to expand police power to permit the use of lethal force when effecting an arrest. Now, when all of this was happening in South Africa during my field work, there were a lot of kind of contradicting, as we see here in Kenya as well, about whether or not this should be passed. So there was extreme outcry, but there was also a lot of tremendous support in order to do this, to give the police more powers, the idea that the criminals were more powerful than the police. So we see a lot of this going on, and of course the very famous Marikana massacre in 2012, where 17 mine circuits were killed and many more were wounded. So we see kind of in a certain phase, we see again this process of remilitarization. At the same time, what we've been seeing in the last few years is what some South Africans have in discussions with me have referred to as a further professionalization. So one of the things that has changed, for example, is the police oversight. So the Independent Police Investigation Directorate has replaced the ICD on the main grounds that the ICD was completely powerless in actually doing things. For example, if they would give recommendations to the police on whether to change certain things, the police didn't have to follow any of the recommendations. So they would come up with many reports on how we think you should change, but the police simply never enforce them. So a new oversight was created to kind of give them more power, and this is something that's been going on recently. And also a transformation task team was set up as a way of kind of, okay, how can we transform the police further? How can we increase professionalism? And we see a wide range of kind of new documents and new crime strategies going on throughout the last year with the paper on police, et cetera, and in a way of reviewing the current South African Police Act. So combined, we see kind of these waves, right? So we see a change, we see a kind of remilitarization going back, and then we see a further professionalization of the police force, so to speak. So to add with some concluding remarks, if that's what they are, a lot of these remarks are not, I guess, not very innovative, and perhaps not new to any of us, but I think we should keep repeating them when we're looking at any form of police reform in any country. Is that, first of all, reform is a process. So a lot of times we think of it as something that happens overnight, or if we do A, B, and C, then people will be reformed. Yet there's many different components to it that we need to look at. Furthermore, when we think about terms of from old school to new, we look at it as a linear process. Well, actually, it's one that it's multidimensional, goes in waves and goes ups and downs. And in order for us to understand it, we need to look at it in that way and embrace it in that way and talk about it in that way and use words that allow us to look at it in such a perspective. A third issue is that in order for us to understand reform, we need to understand that there's contradicting forces at play, both within society as within the state. And this is exactly what Mutuma, how he ended his talk, is that it's not only about institutional reform, it's about changing our society, it's about changing perspectives on how we view things. And that kind of the bottlenecks within police reform are a reflection of some of the bottlenecks that we see in society, that we also, again, need to look at it in this way, and also need to reflect upon ourselves as citizens and how we act in order to change this. Again, the last part, top down and bottom up. This is again a very kind of taken for granted idea, but we need a combination of both. So we can change a lot of legislation, we can implement acts, but we need people on the ground that will actually enforce it. On the other hand, you can have very progressive, if you want to use that word, police officers on the ground who want to make a change, but if their commanding officer is not supporting them in that, nothing will happen either. So we need these both things happening at the same time, and I think that's where the problem is. How do we make a match between these different processes? So how can we make sure that these different efforts kind of tie in together? And the last kind of comment is that we need more research about and with the police. We need to understand more about why are police officers doing what they're doing. It's kind of how Mutuma ended it as well. Police officers are citizens themselves, are very often victims of police violence themselves. So what is going on, not only in Kenya or South Africa, but across the world, and particularly in the US, I mean, a lot of this is happening as well. In order for us to really understand police reform, we need to do more research about the police. So that's ending remark about that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa. So I too have a PowerPoint to show you. Thank you again for the organizers, because this kind of opportunity to exchange, I feel it's very enriching. At least I am being enriched a lot by listening to the intervention and the questions. So this intervention focuses on the issue of impunity, which means impunity means a non-recognition and non-punishment of a police deviance. Police impunity is a very common opinion in France, in my country. It's something that you can feel when discussing with people. It was also the theme for a report from Amnesty France, Amnesty, in 2009, called Policemen Above the Laws. And the Catholic Association Against Torture had another report in 2016, like it exists a civil society report that objectify this feeling of impunity. But before adding some precisions to this definition, I must mention that I have a personal interest in this reflection. So it's me. Because on September 2016, I was assaulted by two policemen while filming a violent identity control of a black woman. I was outside the police station in the north of Paris, in the suburbs north of Paris. And so 2 agents had me enter the police cordon found by around 30 of their colleagues and pressed me on the door, maintaining my 2 arms in my back in a way that blocked my breathing. So I'm just telling that to then mention why I have this experience of impunity in France. And so then for about 10 minutes they multiplied insults, threat to kill or to rape me, claiming that they would find me in my home because I had my address, and finally administered me a taser contact discharge. So when they discovered that I teach in the Sorbonne University, it's another element, they extended the threats to my colleagues, expressing a strong frustration against academics' inclination to defend the democratic control of their work. So this was also testimony of the context I tried to express in my first communication. Many hot political issues were at stake in this interaction. First, the specific policing of racialized people are district inhabitants, so not me, but the woman who was controlled first, the controller was filming. Second, the potential deviation toward an all-powerful feeling among police forces under MSJC states as a justification invoked by these policemen for their acts, on air and a posteriori, was to refer to war on terrorism. Third, the legally protected but practically contested by the law enforcement agents rights to publicize police action. The apparition and spreading of smartphones is often expected to revolutionize public control of police violences, but that assertion has to be nuanced, I think. What happened on this evening also included a fourth component. On the following day, the text I had immediately written to describe the police violence I was subjected to became viral in the internet and caused a strongly mediatized public scandal. In the narrative that was being built by the media, the arrested black lady, a 31-year-old supermarket cashier and single mother, almost disappeared, and I became the unique victim of this evening. This also constituted a strong issue, as it demonstrated the inequalities of representation, if not the segmentations that operates in the arena of police violence recognition and punishment. That is to say, impunity. And for that reason, the feeling of impunity is diversely distributed among the population. My own complaint was classified after a 6-month inquiry by the National Police General Inspection, which is comparable to the institution you spoke about, but is a police institution, so it's inside police institutions. These decisions of classifying my complaint chokes with several testimonies and with a cluster of evidences collected through the investigations, as the destruction of the video surveillance file by the direct supervisor of the policeman involved, or the discovery that one of the latter did have an unregistered taser during the assault, which he had hidden to his hierarchy before destroying it. But it did not choke with the statistics of police sanction mechanism, as studied by a range of social scientists. On the contrary, what one learns reading this literature is that if it had not been mediatized, this case of police violence would most probably have been classified even without any inquiry of the inspection. This experience thus confronted me from a specific and statistically exceptional position to the daily production of impunity as it works in contemporary France, despite the existence, this point has to be underlined, of a strong institutional disposal, this is a common point, of a strong institutional disposal dedicated to the control of police deviance. So before entering in the description of this institutional disposal, the definitional reflection on what is impunity must be deepened, I think. Because impunity, yes, I'm still in the introduction, but it's okay. Impunity is not a legal concept, even if its identification always implies law and the legal system, and often gives rise to political debates on the existing or desirable legislation. So that is to say, it's not a legal concept, even if it is law and legal system is implied in the debate. But still, even if law is implied, impunity is a matter of social recognition as well as sanction. It is a feeling, at least as much as a fact, and its unequal repartition among the social groups has been documented. That is to say that there can be no accurate definition of impunity apart from an attention for the conflictual social issue of defining the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate public violence, between what is considered to be normal in police intervention and what should be denounced. There again, this boundary is dynamic, and it is also often conceived differently according to the social groups, which leads to constant political controversies in the public space, as different definitions of legitimate police violence and police deviance must live together. Here, I would like to suggest, as a researcher specialized in African studies, I would like to suggest the importation of the concept of moral economy that has largely irrigated African studies and have a particular connection with Kenyan studies, as it was invested by John Lonsdale in his famous study of the Mau Mau rebellion, to understand the dynamics of impunity. The latter could be understood as part of a moral economy of legitimate violence, and more accurately a result of an unrecognized and unsolved breach in the expectation on police population relationships. This breach being then a moral resource for collective mobilization, aiming to redefine an acceptable norm for these relationships. So we have a moral economy of legitimate violence, which aims at defining the boundary between what is legitimate and illegitimate, and the feeling of impunity surge at these confrontations. So now that I have clarified my position towards this subject, and I hope so, given some tools to understand sociologically the notion of impunity, I would like to organize this exposé around three main elements extracted from the existing literature. First, the description of the institutional disposal dedicated to police deviance repression in France. So this is the first part. Then an analysis of its inability to punish police violence, even facts predominantly conceived as illegitimate. And to finish with, I would like to reaffirm the necessity to develop a broader view on the issue to be able to consider the widespread feeling of impunity. So first, the institutional disposal for police deviance control and repression in France. I will go faster anyway. There is three kinds of institutions dedicated to this control. First, the hierarchical structure of each police service in charge of daily disciplinary control. Second, the National Police General Inspection, which treats the complaints targeting police deontology, both from the public, from police services, and from judiciary institutions. And third, a new independent institution called the Défenseur des Droits, rights defender. So these three institutions, we can notice that only the Défenseur des Droits, the rights defender, is independent. But in the same time, this independent institution is only a consultative one. It doesn't have any sanctioning power. The sanctioning power is located inside police institutions. Well, I will go faster because I have lots of things to say. And so in this internal power to sanction, the facts, the figures are about that a fifth of the complaints leads to a sanction. So this is the first result extracted from the studies, the literature. But in the same time, we have, and it will be the second part, to enter, this is one of the studies I am mentioning. We have to enter more qualitatively these facts of only 1/5 of sanctions to understand more of what is at stake. Because what this study shows, Cédric Moreau de Bellin's book, what it shows is that if police violence is the most important matter of complaint from the public to the inspection, so it's like 37% of the complaints are for police violence. They account then for only 20% of the sanctions. So there is an underrepresentation in the sanctions of police violence. And second, when you look at this police violence more accurately, you see that it's 11% only of these police violences that are committed out of duty, but this 11% committed out of duty accounts for 71% of the sanctions. So in conclusion, what shows Cédric Moreau de Bellin is that the police violences committed in duty are very, very, very low repressed. It's like 4.2% of the complaints that lead to sanction. So now we should try to understand these results. And two main hypotheses can be convoked to interpret these results. The first one is that as any bureaucracy, the inspection, as any institution, the inspections accord much more importance to its own rules, disciplinary rules, than to the public, the population's imaginaries and representations. And what is the conception, the dominant narrative in the inspection itself is that the repressive abilities are to be used to protect the public use of force and against the privatizations of the means of force by policemen. So any policeman who privatize this force will be repressed, and the repression rate is quite high for this kind of acts. But the public use of force, even if these proportions, is very, very low repressed. And second hypothesis is like this low repression of public force use lies in the conception that as this use of force by police is constitutive to police and to the derogation given to police to use force in societies where the use of force is generally non-admitted. It's like you cannot solve your problems by using force. Only police have this right because it's state. It's like a fundatory characteristic of state. So controlling this use of force would weaken, in the eyes of the inspection, would weaken this derogation to use force. Well, I will now go to the third part, not to be too long. Just to say that if it's very interesting, very enriching to study, to have this ethnography of the internal sanction disposal, this ethnography is very rich for us, but in the same time, it's not enough. Because the feeling of impunity is fueled by much more facts than only this economy of complaints and sanctions inside the inspection. The complaints that can reach the inspection is a very little minority around the range of what is felt as police violence. If you think as daily interactions that produce frustration in France from the public, you can see that the vast majority is outside the scope of what the inspection is seeing. Perhaps we'll have the time to discuss that, but it's the existing of a specific policing for popular district, for post-colonial popular district, with specific brigades, with a large autonomy, with a right to co-opt, to recruit by co-optation. It leads to an institutionalized, and if not institutionalized, strongly tolerated margin of maneuver for deviances which are unrecognized. And second, it's not only, we have to enlarge the scope, not only to the whole policing, but also to see that these qualificative mechanisms that leads to the non-recognition of police violence are not only inside police itself, police institution itself. It's like there is a range of institutions that cumulates their effects to produce these multiple disqualification effects. For example, a police victim will have the same difficulty to complain in the inspection than to complain to a journalist who will believe him, to a lawyer who will think that yes, there is a case, we can win in justice, we can go to success, or to a medical doctor. There is a lot of filters that produce this disqualification of the victims, and we have to see the multi-institutional production of this disqualification. And so my last and conclusive remark is, my last and conclusive remarks derives from the first communication I made in this forum. In this recent phase in France, many elements converge in showing a displacement of the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate violence for large sectors of the population. In a way, there is a process of illegitimation of police violence, visible through the renewed echo encountered by special social movements. So I was discussing this morning. So this tends to redraw the line in the moral economy of legitimate violence. But in the same way, the extending domain of what is considered impunity, in the same way, we should analyze that in the meantime, I will reformulate. In the meantime, that there is this illegitimation process concerning police violences. There was a range of laws and public policies enlarging the police violence capabilities, like the normatization of some ways of acting by police, the enlargement of their rights, of the self-defense law, etc., etc. So there is a breach growing up, perhaps in France, between what is tolerance to police violence, which is going down, and what is the normalization, legalization in the public discourse too of police violence. And so this, the result of this breach is to make of impunity, police impunity, a political cause that is a matter of very strong polarization in French society. And I think it's also an interesting issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Husain Hadid. I'm working with Haki Africa in Mombasa. And my presentation will basically touch on the practical experiences of police practice in the coast of Kenya, particularly in relation to terrorism-related cases and how the police have actually been addressing terrorism at the coast. I think earlier on we spoke about countering violent extremism and then also counter-terrorism. Abdullahi Boru in the morning section spoke about the difference between the two, where counter-terrorism is basically the hardcore, where they go out, they kill, they go to Somalia and things like that. And then there's the countering violent extremism to them, which they define as working with communities to, prevent violent extremism, or so to speak. So I will try and look at both at the same time. And maybe before I proceed to the case studies, just to briefly introduce Haki Africa as an organization that is working at the coast of Kenya to promote and protect human rights. In most cases, yes, the next slide, we deal mainly with issues of human rights and security. And because of that, because of speaking out against excesses of the security agencies, we get very many people or community representatives coming to us with different cases. So most of the cases that I will talk about are actual experiences that we have encountered, people we've dealt with, individuals that we probably knew who are threatened by the security agencies, or people who are arrested and then we were called upon to work with in order to address the underlying issues. So it's not reports that we read or reports that we heard of, but actual cases that we dealt with, we encountered in the dispensation of our work. So before I get into the details or the issues, I want to give some case studies, practical examples of issues or incidences that happened at the coast of Kenya. The first case study is of Hamed Salim. Hamed Salim is or was, we're still not sure because we don't know where he is or his condition. Was working at Masjid Musa on the day it was raided by the police on February 2nd, 2014. He was an electrician, and for a few months before then, he had actually visited a mental hospital because he was suffering from mental illnesses. So he had actually been working at that mosque to repair some of the electrical problems that they had. Unfortunately, on the same day, the police raided the mosque after they said they got intelligence information that there was a training for jihadists inside the mosque. So during that incident, over 100 police officers raided the mosque. just after the lunch period, because during most of these events, they provide lunch. So you had women there, you had children, toddlers, babies actually, and the whole mosque was tear gassed. At the end of the 2 or 3 hours ordeal, 7 people were killed inside the mosque, and 1 police officer was attacked by the youth and stabbed. When they were going in to flush out the people now, they claimed that Hamed actually had the gun of the police officer who was stabbed by the youth. So what happened immediately after that is they put him in a police vehicle with all cameras, all TV stations. There was very clear evidence. They handcuffed him, put him in the police vehicle, and left. So when now people were coming back after a day or two, we got the family of Hamed coming to our office and saying that they can't find their kin. They don't know where he is. They visited all police stations because people who were arrested were either the police station, the prisons, at the hospital, or the bodies were lying at the morgue. And they said they couldn't find him anywhere. So we went back to the news of the day because it's now all on social media and everything. And yes, clearly you could see that he was arrested. He was handcuffed. He was put in a police vehicle. There were about 5 police officers that, were to escort him to the police station. So with that evidence, we of course went to the police, and they said they don't know where he is. They don't know, but they didn't arrest him. So we went to court as Haki Africa on an order of habeas corpus and demanded that the police produce Hamed Salim, dead or alive. To their defense, because we now presented this evidence in court, and for the first time actually, the police allowed social media or videos from the social media as evidence. And the police came and they actually confirmed that yes, that those were their men, that they had actually arrested Hamed. But in their defense, they said as they were driving, or they were taking him to the police station, along the way there was a traffic lights, so the vehicle stopped to allow for traffic. And at that point, Hamed jumped off the vehicle and ran away. And since then, they've not seen him. So that was the story that was presented by the police in a court of law of a suspect that they confirmed they had arrested. Of course, the questioning went on. They were asked, so what's the procedure when someone, a suspect, just jumps out, or you lose a suspect? They say, well, you're supposed to record, report, and all that. Did you do any of that? They said, no, we were arresting very many people, and it was we arrested over 100 people, so somewhere there, they forgot to record that this prime suspect, whom they suspected of being involved in killing one of their own, that actually had escaped. So that's the first case study. The second case study is of Farah Abdi. Farah Abdi is a young man. Well, is or was, we don't know, because he's also missing. We don't know if he's alive or dead, just like Hamed. Farah was first arrested near the border of Somalia, and they said that he was trying to cross the border to join Al-Shabaab. Of course, in his defense, together with his colleagues, they said no, they were just, touring the area, they have relatives there, and so on and so forth. So they were arrested, they were charged in court for attempting to cross or being members of Al-Shabaab. A few months later, the way the police, they put wanted, then they put like 5 or 10 or 12 pictures and say, if you see these people, they're armed and dangerous, please report immediately to the police. Ka chonjo? I don't know, there is a phrase they usually use. Ka macho or something like that. And when that was put in the Nation, I think it was the Nation newspaper, so the family of Farah got in touch with us. And they said, we don't know why they're saying that. Because Farah, yes, they did arrest him, but he has been attending court. They know where he lives. They call him sometimes, and so on and so forth. So we don't understand why they've put him in the papers and why they're saying he's a wanted terror suspect on the run and so on and so forth. So we told them, there's only one thing that you can do. Present yourself to the police. Because if you don't, then it's very clear the next thing you will have is shot and killed Farah. So the family was hesitant initially, and they said, no, we don't want to do that because we don't trust the police. They're going to torture him, they will do this and that, and so on and so forth. So we decided, look, we will be with you all the way. We will also call the leaders so that they cannot later refuse that they actually had him. We'll call the media and say we've handed over Farah to the police, so that later they can't come back and say, well, he wasn't with us, he jumped off the vehicle and somehow ran away. So we agreed that, okay, we'll do that. And, with a lot of hesitation, they agreed to do that. So we did that. We called the media and we presented him to the police, and, we told them we don't understand why you're saying he's wanted and all these issues. So they said, okay, fine, we'll keep him for 14 days to just find out what's happening. And then after that, we'll know what to do, whether to charge him or release him. And the police in Mombasa said those notices were not put up by us. Those are police from Nairobi, ATPU in Nairobi, they're the ones who put that up. Okay, so they held Farah for about 14 days actually. And then after that they said, okay, we have no problem with you, you can go back. Just be attending court so that you can finish your case. So Farah went back home. A few weeks later, as he was sitting in the maskani is like the ghetto, they sit boys, they're just hanging out and all that. 2 vehicles, just suddenly appeared. And armed men, who identified themselves as police officers, jumped off the vehicle and got hold of Farah and another colleague, 2 of them. So they didn't understand. So eyewitnesses, other colleagues who were with them at that point, were narrating this story to us. They said Farah was asking why they're arresting him. He was arrested, he was released, he is attending court, but they didn't want to know anything. They were trying to force him inside the vehicle. The other boy now was even more puzzled, because for him, he's never been arrested. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't know why all this was, so he was resisting even more. It was like, no, it's not me. If you're arresting him, okay, but why are you arresting me? I haven't done anything. And he was really resisting. So what the other boys were telling us, when they found out that he was, not going to go easily, they say one of the police officers just took a hold of his head and twisted it. And immediately on the spot, the boy just fell on the ground. And they picked him and threw him in one of their vehicles. At that point, Farah just went with them, and to date, both have never been seen, and no one knows their fate. That's the second case study. And then the third case study, one might think, okay, this is 2014, 2015, it used to happen, it's not happening anymore. This is happening even as we speak. This case was in December 2017. That's like last month. Ali was at home with his wife. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the police raided his home. And according to the wife, whom we spoke to, and she narrated what happened, when the police came in, her husband had already surrendered. But they first shot him in his legs, and he fell down. And they started asking him questions, and as he was writhing in pain, he was saying, please do what you want, just don't kill me. Just one of the police officers took his gun and shot him at point blank range on his head. Of course, he died instantly. So these are 3 case studies that I would like to talk about after this. The modus operandi for police officers, or the practice as, in the case of the cost, and I'm talking just about the cost. In 2016, we released a report for about 5 years of 89 cases that we could actually verify. People that we spoke to, people who, beyond reasonable doubt, were actually judicially killed or forcefully disappeared. Over 89 cases. Of course, there are many other cases, but we don't have that exact evidence of what happened. Last year, the report for 2017, which will be released in a few weeks' time, maybe in early February, we had 16 cases of killings and disappearances. Again, I'm talking about the cost only, and I'm talking about only terror-related cases. I know we're talking here generally crime and everything, but my reference is only on terror-related cases. 16 cases. There are at least 20 other cases that we are still following up, but because we don't have factual evidence, is someone coming and telling you he was picked, but he was picked, and then he says, I don't want you to quote me because they will come for me, because this is the practice. Once you're labeled a terror suspect, then you're as good as gone, at least at the cost. In fact, we have stories of people who are business rivals or their family feuds or so on and so forth, but then they go to the police and they report to the police that the rival is a terror suspect. And those people have actually disappeared or they've gone missing. So this is not something that you just hear of. There are such cases. In some cases where a suspect is arrested, they are either tortured, held incommunicado, or even when they're brought to court. I'm happy the other day there was a ruling in the High Court that said anyone who has not been charged should not be held by the police. So you either charge a person or you release that person. If you still have to investigate, then you can't hold that person. But this is the practice. When you're held as a terror suspect, you will never be held, in good terms. You will either be tortured or you will disappear. People will not know where you went. The police will say, we released him 3 hours ago. But then no one will know they released you to where. Police threaten family of suspects, and in some cases, guilt by association. We have a ton of youths who were arrested because they had the number of a colleague who was suspected of being a terrorist. So many cases of this kind happen every other single day. We have a wife and a kid who were put in police cells for almost 2 weeks, 3-year-old girl and her mother, because they said they're looking for the husband. And when you ask them, so why are you, keeping the wife and the daughter in police cells, say they're helping with investigations. So this is, a practice that they use quite a lot. Police also target human rights groups. I think we know this. When you speak up, when you say this is wrong, of course they come for you. They threaten individual staff members or organizations like Haki Africa, Muhuri, have been blacklisted and shut down for many months, and I'm sure we remember that practice. In some instances, they have charged suspects in court, but the success rate is usually very poor because of the investigations. They don't present actual evidence, and sometimes they say this is why, they then go back and kill people. I have 5 minutes. Why is this happening? And when we know very clearly that this practice violates the Constitution. Article 24 provides for the non-derogable rights, the rights that cannot be taken away irrespective of what is happening in the country. The right to a fair trial, freedom from torture, right to an order of habeas corpus. These are things within our own Constitution. It does not matter what the problem is or what you're charged with. These are rights that cannot be taken away. But we see them being violated every other day by the police in the practice of fighting terror. The right to life, of course, killing, extrajudicial killings and all that takes away that right. Freedom of security of the person, access to justice, rights of an arrested person, right to a fair hearing, all these are rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. Dr. Ruteere spoke of the post-2010 regime, where we believe we have a good Constitution that is actually supposed to protect our rights and freedoms. But in the terror-related cases, that Bill of Rights is actually suspended. There are no such rights, and when you go to talk to the police, they say, you people don't know what we're dealing with. So to them, these rights are actually suspended in the war against terror. Yet they say they actually are abiding by that same Constitution. So what are some of the effects of these negative practices as we speak? One is the widening gap between the security authorities and communities. I think, is it Guillaume who presented the issue of France, where they said everybody hates the police? Yeah. At the cost of Kenya, that cannot be more true. Everyone hates the police because they believe these are the people who are responsible for what is happening to the communities. This practice also recruits for criminals and terror suspects. And terrorists. We've had a number of youths who have returned, and when they are asked what happened, they said, look, my colleague, my friend, was shot right in front of me. And we know that these people will check their phone. If they have my number or if they know he's my friend, they will come for me next. You actually expect me to sit and wait for them to come for me? That cannot be. So what do? They know the only way out is to actually join Al-Shabaab. For us as an organization, we believe these extrajudicial killings and these enforced disappearances are the #1 cause for youth to join Al-Shabaab. It actually, when you kill one person, you're actually recruiting 5 others to join Al-Shabaab. And the youth have actually disappeared. We're not talking of 10s, 20s, or 100s. We're talking of thousands of youth who have actually left their homes, crossed the border, and are now with Al-Shabaab. The other day I was reading the papers. I think it was about 30 university students who've not gone back to school, and 58, and are feared to have crossed the border to join Al-Shabaab. 58. And we need to ask ourselves, why is this happening? And the question is very clear. The practices, the police practices on terrorism is contributing largely to this scenario. Misrule of law, when police are killing, why can't we others kill? These are people who are supposed to be the custodians of the law, yet they're abusing the same laws that they're supposed to be, protecting. So then people feel, okay, this is okay, it's all right. So you have criminal groups that are coming up, they're killing people, they're stabbing people, and doing all sorts of things. After all, we are learning from the best, or so they say. Violation of human rights, of course, that goes without saying. Very quickly, as I conclude the recommendations, respect constitutional rights. I think that is very clear. We have a very good constitution, and we must adhere to the rights that are enshrined in that constitution. Apply the rule of law. We are not saying that all these suspects are innocent. There's a very high possibility that majority of them could be guilty of what the police are accusing them of. But it's very simple. Let's just follow the law. Arrest the suspect, take them to court. If, as a force, you have enough evidence to kill that person, I believe that same evidence taken to court should be able to get a positive ruling for the police. Address underlying grievances. Of course, the coast has, for many years, for decades since independence, complained of successive governments' marginalization and discrimination. Some of these ideologies actually contribute to the worsening situation. So I believe we need to also address most of these grievances for us to address the problems that we have. Partnership with civil society, again, also very important and crucial. I think civil society currently are the most trusted. In a poll that was done, I believe by Information. The civil society is the most trusted sector in the country. And we need to build that more so that we can support the working with police and communities. I believe civil society can actually play the bridge. I think, I will stop it at that. Sorry if I rushed, but I had a few minutes. Thank you.